Okay, hello. Well, welcome everyone. Welcome back to my film class live here. Today we're going to have a very cool video. We're going to be talking about expressions in After Effects, which is one of my favorites to talk about. We're going to be covering some really cool expressions, including the loop expressions, so loop in, loop out. We're also going to be covering time, and we're also going to be looking at the wiggle expressions. And these are some of the most commonly used expressions in After Effects. So it's going to be very cool to be able to cover them, and it's going to be something that you're going to be able to use, hopefully, in every design that you ever do on After Effects, which is very cool as well. One thing to quickly mention before we start this live stream is that I am live on my design class just before this live stream every Monday as well. So if you're interested in Adobe Photoshop or any other design software as well, do tune into that. Today we had a look at text in Adobe Photoshop and some cool things such as warping and how to add text to paths. So if that's something that you would like to learn, it's something you can also integrate very easily into Adobe After Effects actually. So that's also handy to know. So if you are interested in that, do feel free to check that out every Monday. And on another note, another thing that I've started just this week is I'm going to be having a weekly newsletter. So if you'd like to stay ahead and know what we're going to be talking about in the next live stream, then do feel free to sign up for that. It's completely free. It's going to help you be able to access the content in advance, not the live streams, but I'm going to be adding some descriptions and some context information prior to the live stream so you can have a go at things. And then the idea is hopefully that when you come to these live streams, you might have some problems or things that you've tried that maybe didn't work, which you can then talk to me about in the live stream, and we can hopefully try and answer. But without further ado, let's jump right into Adobe After Effects and learn some of the basic expressions which we can use. So the first expression that we're going to be having a look at is the loop expression. And the looping expression, essentially, it does what it says. It allows us to loop certain keyframes, certain animations, and make it happen several times over an infinity duration. So for example, I have this simple animation here of a tiger. So if I just play this, just so you can see, very simple animation. He literally just opens and closes his mouth. But say I want him to loop this animation, and I want him to keep opening and closing his mouth and keep doing this roar like he's doing. Well, the easiest way to do this, you can apply this expression and any of these expressions to any property that you have in Adobe After Effects, which you can keyframe. So you can see at the moment, if I open the animation itself as a separate composition, we have several keyframes for all of these things, and the duration of the animation is 3 seconds and 13 frames. So that's important because I'm just going to go back to my tiger expression, and I'm actually going to enable time remapping just by right-clicking on the layer, going to time, and enable time remapping. So this is again to allow me to animate the expression, the composition, and the entire duration of the composition. So I know that my animation ends at 3 seconds and 13 frames. So I'm going to create a keyframe at this point. I'm going to delete the final keyframe. And everything that happens within 3 seconds and 13 minutes, I can now manipulate. So if I want to speed it up, I'll move this keyframe slightly closer. And as you can see, the animation is going to play just that bit quicker. Now, obviously, the advantage of using expressions is that we don't actually manually have to add all of the keyframes ourselves. So for example, one of the ways you might quickly do this is just copying and pasting these keyframes and trying to loop it yourself manually. Obviously, the downside of this is that we have to do it manually. It's going to cost us a lot of time to do this. So if I press play now, you're also going to notice that there's actually a gap between our keyframes. It's not going to be a consistent animation. So this is where expressions come in to help us. So expressions, if you're unfamiliar with expressions, just in general, they're based on JavaScript, so the coding language JavaScript, and in After Effects they essentially tell properties to do something. So anything that we animate using our stopwatch and keyframes, we can add an expression to in order to simplify our lives and get it to repeat something or change the values of that property. If you're using scripts, that's slightly different. Scripts are actually for the application to do something. So just After Effects in general. So there is a clear distinction between expressions and scripts. But for expressions, let's learn how we can add an expression. So in order to add an expression to any of our designs, or to any property, what we can do is hold Option or Alt on our keyboard, go to the stopwatch and press once. And this will bring up the expression option, so we can add expressions to this property. So at the moment we have time remap, which is essentially the property. So it's just telling us that at the moment that's what it is. We have some basic symbols here. The first one is whether we want to enable the expression or not. If we have that turned off, even though if we have an expression written down here, it's not actually going to play it in our animation. And that's pretty helpful if, for example, you're trying to debug something or decode something, and maybe you've applied expressions to a whole load of different things, or you want to quickly see how it works without the expression. That's a quick way of just enabling or disabling it without deleting the expression. The second option we'll get to into a minute. It basically allows us to see the expressions on graphs, which can be very handy if we use things such as easy ease, or we're trying to manipulate speed or values. The pick whip, just like any other pick whip in After Effects, you can quickly grab other details. For example, I can grab the values of the time remap. So we'll be covering that with the position just in a minute. And this last option is actually pretty cool as well. It's a menu that allows us to see some of the most common expressions that you might want to use. So for example, the property that we're going to be using, which is LoopIn and LoopOut, as you can see, it's written here and it gives us an indication of what we might need to use in order to use that expression. So if you're looking for an expression, this might be an easy way to have a quick look to see what you can actually manipulate using expressions. But what we want to do is to loop our animation. So we're going to start by using the LoopOut expression. So the expression is literally just loop out, like so. And then we have an open bracket and close bracket. You can leave it like this, but I'm going to try and use the correct language so that you can see exactly what's going on. So we're going to start off with loop out cycle, and then I'm going to put a semicolon in order to end the expression. So the loop out function, there are two options. We have loop in and loop out. Loop out will essentially loop anything post our final keyframe. So if I had a whole load of different keyframes here, if I just add another one in or something, it's only going to loop out after our final keyframe. The loop in expression, which we'll look at in a minute, is only going to loop before our first keyframe. So what you'll notice, if I play this animation now, it's not going to do anything until it hits the keyframe, run the keyframes, and then it's going to loop after the keyframes, just like that. If I change this to loop in, like so, it's going to loop prior to the first keyframe, and then it's going to stop after the final keyframe, just like that. So that's the difference between loop in and loop out. Now, as you can see, I've put cycle within the brackets here. And that basically allows us to choose what kind of looping expression we're trying to use. So this is the same for loop in and loop out. I'm going to use loop out just because that's more commonly used, because we normally want to loop whatever we've got after our expressions. So let me just delete this keyframe as well. So now we've just got our simple looping expression. So we have a few different options for the different types of looping we can do within After Effects. So the first one is cycle, which is this. It's literally going to loop from the first keyframe to the second keyframe, and it's going to continuously do that. It's going to go from the start to the end, and then it's going to go back to the start and go to the end again. We've also got continue, ping pong, and offset. And in order to demonstrate that, I'm actually going to use a different composition. I'm going to use this one of a car. So we've applied it to a time remapping, but we can also apply it to some of the simple transformations that we learned in last week's live stream. So the first one we might want to do is position. So I'm actually going to make this car slightly smaller just by using the scale. And I'm going to go to P in order to move it slightly to the left, maybe something like this. So let's say I have a very basic animation, and this car is going to move in all sorts of different weird ways. So we're going to go like this, and then maybe at 10 frames, it's going to move down slightly, and less than move it just along so it's not flying anymore. So our animation is just like that. So if we apply our expression, so holding Option or Alt for Windows, and then typing in loop out, And then again, let's put cycle. And pressing play. As you can see, it's going to loop that animation, those keyframes. It's going to go to the start, go back to the start, etc. Let's try a different one. So let's change this to ping pong and see what happens. So with the ping pong looping expression, as you can see, it's going to go from the start and it's going to go back once it hits the final keyframe and reverse it to the start and go back to the final keyframe. So it's just going to go back and forth between our starting and our final keyframes in order to get an expression like this. And that can be very handy if you're looking for something that maybe moves in this kind of motion. And then the second one that we have is continuous or continue. So continue is an interesting one. It's only going to loop whatever the final keyframe was doing. So as you can see, it's going to just continue driving along just like that and leave our screen. So continue is only ever going to do the final kind of motion within your animation. And that can be very handy if you, for example, have a transition that at the start of your animation. So for example, the car does this motion, or you have something that spins or something. Or for example, with title animations, a lot of the time, if you have a title and you want to scale it in really dramatically, and then it slowly scales back down, or it scales up, but at a slower rate, this is an easy way to be able to do that without actually having to keyframe that all the way, because it will only do that final kind of animation and continue that. The final option that we have out of the 4 is offset. So offset is similar to continue. Offset, there we go. However, it actually continues the entire animation. So all of the keyframes. So as you can see, it's going to just keep adding, and it's cumulative, so it's going to keep adding on from whatever we had and keep adding those values and keep repeating all of those processes. So as you can see, that's another easy way to actually loop out without having to manually keyframe all of that, which could take quite a long time in order to work out all of those positions and the values of those mathematically. So there's a few modifiers that we can use for loop out as well, if you want to make it even more complex, or you only want to target specific things within your animation. So the first one is you can add a comma at the end of whatever modifier you've tried to use for loop out. So we've chosen offset. So the modifier you can add is how many keyframes back you want this animation to start. So for example, at the moment it's considering all of the keyframes within our animation. If I quickly add a few extra keyframes, so let's say our car does this and it does that. Let's say it does this kind of complex animation. I want to use offset, so I want it to repeat this animation, but I actually only want it to repeat. As you can see, it's going to continue just doing all of these motions. I actually only wanted to repeat this keyframe, the last keyframe, this keyframe, and this one. So instead of doing this first jump as well, I only wanted to repeat these two. Well, what we can do is we can add a modifier. So we can, at the end of offset and the dialogue quotation marks, we can put a comma. And I'm going to put the number 2 because from the last keyframe, I want to go back 2 keyframes. So 1, 2. So I'm going to place 2. And now, if I press play, it's only going to loop those last 2 keyframes. Like so. If you didn't want to do it on a keyframe basis and you want to do it on a time basis, for example, you only want to loop everything within the last, let me move this out slightly so it's a bit easier. Let's say we move it out like this. I'm at 1 second and 10 frames. Let's say I only want to loop everything within the last second of the animation. So from 10 frames, that would be to 10 frames here. Well, what we'd do is we'd actually use a different expression. We'd use loop out duration, like so. And then I'd put 1. Now it's going to loop everything after 1 minute. And just like that. So that's two easy ways in order to actually modify the loop expression in Adobe After Effects. Another useful way to apply this is if we wanted to animate the car, for example, the wheel. There's several ways we can do this, and I'm also going to cover the other expression that I wanted to talk about, which was time. So for an animation like this, what we normally, if we have the left wheel here and say we want it to rotate, so we want an animation where the wheel of the car is rotating and spinning just like this. Well, we could go ahead and animate that. So I could do, well, it starts at 0, and then I can create a keyframe here, and then I say, well, by 2 seconds, I want it to have made maybe 3 full rotations. And then as you can see, it's going to do that, but anything after that, it's going to stop. Also, another good way to apply this next one is if you're using a clock and you want it to be quite mathematical, maybe you want the clock to actually follow real time, then this next expression is really helpful, and that is time. So if we click on the stopwatch and actually add a keyframe, what we can do is we can use time to manipulate how long it takes for us to complete a rotation. So the easiest way to do this is to put value plus time. So for example, if we have our current value of 0 degrees, we can create time as the main value. However, this change is going to be very small because time is the number of seconds. So for example, once we hit 1 second, it's going to be 1. The value of time at 3 seconds is going to be 3. So it's going to take quite a while for it to reach, but I can play it, but it'll rotate very, very slowly. You can see the wheels slowly rotating. So what we can do is just add a mathematical equation to that. So for example, we can do time times maybe 100. And at this rate, the wheel is going to move much, much quicker. So it's taking the current time. So when it's at 1 second, it's going to take 1 times 100, and the degrees is going to be 100. At 2 seconds, it's going to be 2 times 100, and it's going to be 200. If you want it to go faster, obviously you could do like 1,000, and then it's going to spin very, very quickly, just like that. So that's an easy way to add time to your animations in order to actually save you a lot of time having to keyframe this. And it's also automatically just going to calculate it for you. And it's very handy. Say you had a clock, animation of a clock where the wheel, you had the first handle and you wanted it to move around all the way by 1 second. Well, at 1 second, you could just apply an equation that you wanted time times 360. So at 360, so when it's 1 second, it's going to do 1 times 360, which is 360 degrees. So at 1 second, it's going to make a full rotation. And just like that, you're going to have a clock that is going to be very accurate if that was something that you needed within your assets. Obviously, you could also do this with LoopOut, like we just learned. So if I delete this expression, say I went to the start at 0 seconds, created a keyframe, and I went to 1 second and did 1 times. So it makes 1 full rotation. There we go. So we got our wheel spinning, and then apply our expressions. We can do loop out. And if you leave this brackets empty and you don't play cycle, it's automatically going to use the default, which is cycle, like we just learned. So just like this, it's now going to just keep on rotating and looping out like so. Obviously, if we wanted to use the loop in, we could do so. If you needed it to stop at a certain point, so for example, the car stops moving, then you could say, let's stop it at 3 seconds. It's going to loop in, it's going to be moving, and then it's going to stop at 4 seconds, just like that. And that's an easy way to be able to use those two expressions, so time and loop out and loop in order to be able to quickly animate things that we maybe don't want to spend as much time doing just by using keyframes. Like so. So the last expression that I also wanted to cover was the wiggle expression, which is a really great way in order to make your animations look slightly more random and for them to look a bit more organic. So the wiggle expression is basically a bit of a randomizer. It takes the values and it creates a random value within a range from that original value. So for example, if I go back to our main composition here, and just get rid of this, like so. And let's say I place the car in the center here and I'll make it slightly larger. Let's say I want this car to move in the x-axis. Actually, we'll cover that in a minute. I'll just do the wiggle one first. So let's say I want it to move in a random way. Well, we could add an expression and we can type in wiggle. And there's two values the wiggle expression needs. The first is the number of times you want it to wiggle within a second. So let's say I want it to wiggle once within a second. And then the next is the range of values you want it to wiggle by, or the max and min almost. So if your position is, let's make this a bit more obvious, let's say 1000 and 500 for the Y. Let's say I want it to move in the X and Y axes by about, at its max, 50 in either direction. Well, then what I do is I type 50, and it's going to wiggle within a range of 50 for both of those values. As you can see, it's completely random. It's just going to move the car in both of those directions in completely random ways. I could obviously increase the frequency of the wiggle by increasing the first number, the number of times it wiggles, so 5. As you can see, it's going to move much more randomly. And I can also increase the range. So for example, I could do 1000, and it's really going to wiggle on and off screen, and it's going to be quite disjointing. So that's a way to use the wiggle expression just to make that animation slightly more random and organic. For example, if you're doing something that's very specific and it looks like it's just very well curated and you want it to look a bit more natural, then this is a great way to be able to apply that. Another thing to do and to note is that if you do have two different values for a property, so whereas with the rotation we only had the degrees, or the scale you only have percentage, in position you have two different values. You have the x axis coordinates and you have the y axis coordinates. So you can actually also divide this up. So if you only want the x axis to wiggle and not the y axis, that is possible. So we'll just quickly show you how to do that. So we'll just create an expression just like this. And I'm going to type in two basics. So I'm going to type in x equals y equals. I'm just going to lay out our expression. Then I'm going to open square bracket and I'm going to do x comma y. I'm just going to add a space here. So what we have is I'm defining the x value and I'm defining the y value. And then at the end, whatever's in the square brackets is what After Effects is actually going to apply. So it's going to apply the x and the y here. So for the x value, I want it to take the transform property. So I can use the pick whip, like I said earlier, and drag, and I can select the x value. And now we can transform this x value using what we want. I can now select for the y, just by selecting it here, I can use the pick whip and select the y. And now our x value and y values are as we have selected here. So at the moment, nothing should happen because all we're doing is taking the value that we currently have and saying to After Effects, please use that value. So it's not going to move because we haven't applied any mathematical equation at the moment. So another thing, what we can do is, for example, if I want to wiggle the x-axis, what I can do is type wiggle in here. And I can choose, once again, how many times I want it to wiggle. So maybe once. And let's say I want it to wiggle by 50, something like so. And I'm going to quickly also add 0 because I want it to take that first value here. There we go. So the 0 is the first value that we have, the first dimension, and the 1 here is the second. So this basically says, for the x, go and look in the transform property of this layer. Go and look within the position and select the first value, which is x. And the same for this, transform position and look for the second value, which is 1. It's a bit weird that it can be a bit confusing at the start, that you think 0 is not a value and that 1 is 1. But 0 is the first value and 1 is the second value. So now it's going to wiggle the first value and leave y as y is. And as you can see now, it's only going to wiggle in the x-axis, just like that. It's not very apparent because our dimensions aren't very high. Maybe let's set it to 200. And now you should notice that the car is going to wiggle only in the x-axis. If you wanted to do it for the y, it's the exact same process. You could, in fact, now that you have this information here, where you have the wiggle and you have the 0, you could actually completely get rid of the X, like so. You can also do this for the Y, so you want the Y to wiggle as well, but you actually don't want it to wiggle just as much. So for example, only once, and perhaps within a radius of within 50, perhaps, and then you open square brackets, and we press 1 because we want to take that first value, like so. We could actually completely get rid of this other information, like so. Just add a semicolon to finish the expression. And now, as you can see, the y-axis is not going to vary as much because this second wiggle expression is only applied to the y value. And the first x-axis value is going to be much, much more dramatic. And you can see this within the actual numbers and the position itself. So you can see our starting number, which isn't correct anymore, but it was 1000 and it was 500. You can see how those values change over time, just like that. And that's an easy way to apply wiggle to different properties within, within different dimensions within a property. So that's an easy thing to do like that. So those are the basic expressions that I wanted to cover today. They're very, very handy. Try and use them in all of your projects if you can. The wiggle expression, like I said, helps you to make animations very, very natural looking. Time is just a great one if you want to quickly be able to manipulate something over time. And expressions really do help make your life much, much easier when it comes to animating in Adobe After Effects. So like I said at the start, there is going to be a free weekly newsletter. It's completely free to sign up. The link is in the description below. If you want to, it's going to just have some extra information, some extra insights for design and animation. And it's also going to help you get to know what we're going to be covering in the next live stream, so that if you want to prepare ahead, perhaps have a go at it yourself, try out a few of the techniques, and come to the live stream with any questions that you might have or any of the problems that you may be faced, and we'll be able to debug those and actually go over those in person. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be probably live here next again on Monday. And do feel free to check out the other live stream I did on my design class if that is something that you're interested in. So thank you very much for tuning in, everyone, and I'll see you in the next one.